Hi, my name is Chris Davila. I'm the treasurer for the Duluth branch NAACP, and I'm happy to be here with you celebrating Black History Month. As a queer person of color, I wanted to share portions of an article entitled The Black History of Rioting by Jonathan Borg. You can find the full article on refinery29.com. The first Pride was a riot. This June, the LGBTQ plus community has routinely shared 6 words across social media. Activists and demonstrators in support of the Black Lives Matter movement use them to remind us that there's a clear through line between the fight for LGBTQ plus rights in the United States and revitalized push for anti-racist legislation that protects people of color, especially Black Americans. Leading queer championing organizations such as GLAAD are encouraging the LGBTQ plus community to look within and to revisit history. The anger that has erupted after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and thousands of other Black people is deeply and historically connected to gay liberation. The first Pride was indeed a riot, but history has been written to disqualify and erase the efforts of those at the front lines, the Black queer community, the Black transgender women in particular. To unpack that fragmented and compartmentalized history, we first need a little background. The 1960s are considered the last great reform era in American history, a time when citizens grew fed up with the violence and injustice. In addition to the civil rights movement and ardent efforts to overturn Jim Crow laws, marginalized communities also fought for women's liberation, the abolishment of police brutality, and the end of the Vietnam War. At the time, LGBTQ plus individuals were regularly arrested for having consensual sex that violated sodomy laws, kissing in public, gathering in bars, or simply existing if they were perceived to be queer. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual considered being gay a mental disorder. In fact, the Psychiatric Association didn't remove homosexuality as a disorder until 1973. And then came Stonewall, a series of events that perfectly illustrates how the revolutionary elements of the fight for civil rights influenced gay liberation. There are hundreds of contradictory and inconsistent accounts of the Stonewall riots, but what we do know is that on the night of June 27th, 1969, the Stonewall Inn witnessed a violent police raid on drag queens, transgender people, and gay people, a majority of whom were Black or brown. These events led to 6 days of protest on Christopher Street in New York City, and what we now know as the Stonewall Uprising. Some of the leading figures fighting for justice at Stonewall were Black transgender women, most famously Marsha P. Johnson. Johnson, who, when asked, would say the P initial stood for pay it no mind in the context of her gender, was a performer and activist. According to the Marsha P. Johnson Institute, she described herself as gay, transvestite, and a drag queen. In several books, including Lillian Fodderman's The Gay Revolution, The Story of the Struggle, Johnson is remembered for climbing a lamppost and shattering an officer squad car with a heavy object, which prompted other protesters to strike the police with pennies, beer cans, and glass bottles. Sylvia Rivera, a brown trans woman who participated in anti-war and Black liberation marches, also heavily influenced the Stonewall riot and its subsequent protests. So did Miss Major Griffin Gracie, a Black trans activist who eventually worked for the Transgender Variant Intersex Injustice Project. From Stonewall to the very first Pride March in 1970, the Christopher Street Liberation Day March, Black, trans, and queer people have always been the ones willing to take the most votive action, whether it was throwing the brick or the first punch, says Al Hearns, a founder and executive director of the Marsha P. Johnson Institute. Quote, "We've always been at the center of the movement. Black trans women like myself were always on the front lines, and Marsha P. Johnson is a great example of what it looks like to take action in every aspect of your life," end quote. Unfortunately, So many of the vocal Black queer activists that fought during the 60s and 70s are largely understudied when compared to their white counterparts. Names like Kathy Kozachenko, Elaine Noble, Leonard Matlovich, and Harvey Milk are widely known for their contributions to the LGBTQ+ rights. Black activists aren't as celebrated despite the essential roles they played. A select few include Bayard Rustin, a key advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., writer, poet, and activist Audre Lorde, Ernestine Eckstein, a leader of the Daughter Abilitas, the first lesbian and civil rights organization in the US, Barbara Jordan, the first Black woman elected to the Texas Senate, writer and scholar Angela Davis, and author James Baldwin. Today, activists like Hearns, who is also a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, are working to prevent the erasure of Black queer folks, especially Black transgender women, and the whitewashing of queer history. Donating to her Marsha P. Johnson Institute, for instance, helps uplift these voices. Black transgender women are disproportionately affected by fatal violence. According to the National Center for Transgender Equality, more than 1 in 4 trans people have faced bias-driven assault. The organization states that more than 1/5 or 22% of transgender people who have interacted with the police reported harassment, and the rates are much higher for Black transgender individuals. 38% reported harassment and 15% reported assault by officers. This is why the fight for equality and the end to police brutality seen in the 1960s and 70s and reflected in today's unrest begins with Black queer people, especially Black transgender women. Thank you.